AP Language and Composition friends. Kristian Kuhn coming at you, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of Composition. And what we're going to do in this writing workshop is break down FRQ3 from the 2024 exam, set 1, that good old selfie essay. And this writing workshop is really cool because I had the honor and the privilege to teach 24 AP language rookies. And what you're going to look at here are exemplars and models that teachers wrote to demonstrate the process for their students next year. So the quality of the writing is going to be really good, and what they're going to be doing is manipulating my heuristics. So we're going to approach the introductory paragraph with either the declarative or the inverted thesis heuristic. And then we're going to slip into this cool Aristotelian model called the syllogistic method to build our body paragraphs. And this one was a little tricky, right? My kids came back from the exam and they're like, dude, Kuhn, this was a little slippery. So we actually had some great discussions, the 25 of us, about this piece in terms of how to unpack the diction of the prompt. Big discussion about like what is substantive textual support to offer within the body paragraphs, to build upon and prove our thesis statement. So I'll go top to bottom. We'll take a look at like 3 introductions. We'll take a look at a few body paragraphs, and I'll even show you how I advise my students to do the conclusion paragraph. So if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so. Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross at Composition. Sprinkle a little love on that like, tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your students. Help me beat the tricky algorithm so that I can get this content out there far and wide. So other thing is, all the slides that you're going to see in this presentation are down in the bottom of the description. So you got to scroll down just a tad bit. They're for free. Use them with your students. As I said, they're really good exemplars and models. So, hopefully it can demystify the writing process for your students with regards to FRQ3. So let's begin with the prompt. In a 2013 New York Times article on the practice of taking selfies, writer, editor, and podcast host Jay Wortham wrote, "Rather than dismissing the trend as a side effect of digital culture or a sad form of exhibitionism, maybe we're better off seeing selfies for what they are at their best, a kind of visual diary, a way to make our short existence to mark our short existence and hold it up to others as proof that we were here. Write an essay that argues your position on the extent to which Wortham's claim about the value of documenting one's life with selfies is valid." And what we got to do first and foremost is unpack the key diction within this. And what we talked about was the exhibition aspect of it, the vanity of selfie culture, and then the preservation of the history, so like all epics of time, for the most part, left something for future generations to say, hey, they were here. And maybe it's because all of us were, I think, like 30 years or older that were working on this. I think maybe our boomer perspective influenced our interpretation of this prompt. So most of us disagreed with the prompt. And when my kids came back from the exam, by and large, the bulk of them agreed with it. And the teachers that cobbled together this workshop for you, we pretty much uniformly disagreed with it. So I'll show you both angles as we proceed through this. Now, one little tidbit of advice that I give my students before they place pen to paper or get their fingertips above the keyboard is you got to know your direction, right? Because if you're figuring it out in the midst of writing, in the midst of creating, you're going to go wayward and get super discursive and really have a tough time sustaining and holding on to the line of reason. So what we do is write 4 paragraphs for all of the FRQs for AP Language and AP Lit. So intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So in terms of directionality, I ask my kids to choose like two substantive things to talk about in the second premise of their syllogisms. And what I mean by that is, specific, concrete textual support. What's your example going to be? So let's see how this all unfolds here. So student is at their blank screen. You're looking at their blank sheet of paper. You got to ask the question. So how do I write the intro? And as I already alluded to, you got to declare or invert the thesis. And then those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that I always espouse the following idea. You got to Bob Ross your instructions. So very early in my career, I asked a pretty kind of weird question, but it makes sense to me. What if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? Meaning we get to the proverbial easel and canvas and air quote paint with and for our students. So they see our writing. We position ourselves as the expert writers in the classroom. And that's what I was doing in this teacher training with the 24 teachers, is teaching them how to write so that they can model and provide like really good exemplars for their students. Again, like it totally demystifies the writing process when we teach writing explicitly versus assign it. So it's a good practice, and I would encourage you all to do it. So first and foremost, students can declare the thesis. So it's called the declarative thesis model. And what you do with this is you declare the thesis. You begin with the thesis. And then what you're going to do is sprinkle in the context and background. Go back to what I was just saying about know thy direction. So I call it dropping the seeds for the line of reasoning. So you kind of hint implicitly the directionality of your piece. Where are you going in the body paragraph? So that's what I mean by context and background. We do have an academic audience, so I do want to see a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. And all I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. And then again, for those that are familiar with my work, and even those that are unfamiliar with my work, you know that I run nuance academies within my classroom. And one major element or component of that is I explicitly teach the 12 sentence types and the 20 sentence patterns. And I do this so that kids can cultivate nice voice rhythm flow and be veritable like syntactical ninjas at sentence level, because young and emerging struggling writers often over rely on short, simple declarative sentences and independent clauses, which yields that tone that we've all heard when we've graded papers, da 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 da, and that's too elementary at the AP level. And then there's some math to this. I ask my students to write 4 sentences for every introduction that they construct across the board, all 3 FRQs. Now, we can take that declarative and flip it on its head, and this is called the inverted thesis heuristic. And in this case, you just end with a thesis, right? So either thesis goes first sentence or it goes fourth sentence. And all the same stuff, stays static in this, right? You need to have some tier 2, cook up the sentence constructs, drop the seeds for the line of reasoning, like unpack the diction of the prompt, 4 sentences. So let's take a look at a teacher sample here. I'll read it top to bottom, and then I'll kind of unpack it for you. Unlike other civilizations that preceded the modern era, our collective history will be erased and forgotten because of the side effects of digital culture. In terms of historical preservation, contemporary society has regressed in spite of the alleged technological advancements. Little more than offering an ego-frenzied digital footprint that is quite ephemeral, selfies do nothing more and nothing less than capture the triviality of modern existence. Unlike other epochs in history, such as the Mayans and Indus, we will be dust in the wind as digital clouds and social media inevitably vanish and give way to other advancements. So let's talk about this. The thesis statements manifest, right? So you kind of got to agree or disagree with the quote. And then one key thing, and unfortunately, I think a lot of students fell prey to this. You got to focus on both aspects of the prompt, right? the idea of cataloging history, but also that, vanity point, right? That it's just some trite thing that teenagers do, taking selfies. So you can see this teacher, got anchored in both of those ideas in terms of like the ego frenzied digital footprint, but also collective history will be erased and forgotten. So it's really key that students get anchored there. Now, I was talking about the seeds of the line of reasoning. And in that last sentence, this teacher writes, unlike other epics in history, and then she shows her cards, right? So students oftentimes will do this kind of to set up their line of reasoning and just have like a pivot point into the body paragraphs. You can see that the vocab is up, and I know some teachers are going to say, my kids can never write that way. Here's my point of contention with that. Bob Ross never dumbed it down, right? I think when we model, do not dumb it down. Show kids excellent work and they will rise their game. They'll elevate, right? They will approximate. They mock us, right? And gradually over time, that's where you see the progress, the growth, the maturation until boom, they flourished into really good writers. And then at sentence level, note how each sentence is stylistically different than the one that precedes it. So one of the rules I have for my students is pay attention to the sentence you just dropped and don't replicate it. So usually you don't have like parallel syntax until you move down into the conclusion of the syllogisms where you're hammering your point, right? You're really arguing your point. So you might truncate those sentences and go short, simple, declarative, because that's what we do when we argue, right? That's like an argumentative linguistic twist that we do. So that's the whole kit and caboodle for example number 1. So it might be pie in the sky. Let's unpack it and do it again. Here's number 2. Because of the temporal nature of digital culture, history's future will have a hard time remembering this current epoch of time. Unlike the words of Jesus, which were captured in permanence, and unlike Aristotle, whose words, life, and legacy were also fixed in the annals of history, digital documentation of our present day will vanish into the ether, as will the digital cloud, the internet, and social media platforms. This particular method of preserving history, unfortunately, will not endure. Further, the bulk of what is captured through selfies is nothing more and nothing less than the ego delighting in its own vanity. So again, you got, the thesis is anchored to both elements of the prompt, right? That vanity aspect and then, the preservation aspect. So that's all good. The sentence constructs are really good in terms of achieving the voice, rhythm, and flow. The vocab is really good without overdoing it, right? I don't want my students to espouse that idea that if they use $1 million words, somehow, some way, they're, producing stellar writing. So we've got to disabuse some of our students of that. And it's all there, right? So we kind of get a sense of the seeds for the line of reasoning, mentioning Jesus and Aristotle. But one of the fascinating things that we discussed, all 25 of us, and again, you got to consider and factor our age. We were talking about things that documented our history. So I'm 49, right? And my parents use the old camera. So I'm in Rochester, New York, George Eastman land, right? The land of Kodak. So I am preserved because my parents printed those photographs. So my kids can see me as a kid. And one of the things we discussed is the fact that and I don't use Snapchat. I've never used it before, so this was kind of a learning lesson for me. Apparently, like a Snapchat, so kids take selfies, for Snapchat, and they disappear within 24 hours. I did not know that. And then it looks like the longest amount of time you can catalog those recordings is 30 days, right? And then poof, it's gone, it's vanished. So you have no documentation whatsoever. And we were talking about kind of the ephemeral nature of technology, VCRs, cassette tapes, CDs, Walkmans, the Atari. So oftentimes this stuff becomes obsolete. Do we recollect it? Do we recall it? Do we preserve it? Yes. But the thing with a lot of this digital stuff is, where will the cloud be, years down the road? Where will the preservation of this content be stored? And I think we all were sort of on the same page that it could potentially just poof, vanish, be gone. So let's paint another one and kind of take a different slant on the thesis. For the typical teenager, they record the comings and goings of their days via the selfie. Given the case, in spite of how fleeting life is, modern existence will preserve this particular epoch of time. While not everything that is captured in our digital culture is as significant as an Anne Frank diary or a biblical gospel, humanity within this particular moment in time is captured and documented, perhaps even more so than at any other point in human history. While there is unquestionably an element of vanity, selfies serve as a quasi-modern time capsule that will allow future generations access into our culture and ways of existence. So this just takes the flip thesis to demonstrate for students how to do it. And you can see it's executed the exact same way. Tier 2, sentence constructs, place the thesis first or place the thesis last. It doesn't matter, roll out 4 sentences, right? So that's kind of the framework of this particular heuristic. And one of the things that this teacher did, younger teacher, she was talking about some of the prominent social media personas. And again, I really don't pay attention to that stuff as a boomer myself. And she ripped a really good essay, and we can take a look at that in just a second. But in terms of the specificity of the textual support, I hope that my students went that route, but my hunch is that students were really vague. And one of the things I hammer all year long with my students for FRQ3 is, I say this nonstop, it's like my mantra: specificity, specificity. And I think this prompt sets students up to be a little vague in the textual support. And in the exemplars that we're going to take a look at specifically for the body paragraphs, we'll look how to beef that up, which takes me to the next question. So how do I construct the bodies? And you can see there my speech bubble says, get specific. As I've alluded to, we're going all the way back to Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the town's boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would often tussle with juicy, essential questions. And I'll take one that's seminal from Plato's Republic. What is justice? And Aristotle, as the teacher, would observe how his students argue. And he said, haha, I got it. The students that argue impeccably and have really tight, cogent lines of reasoning, they have like a mathematical computative execution in their argument. And he called it the syllogistic method. And like sort of look at this mathematically. So he went premise, conclusion. I'll give you an example. So if I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you all would nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, you're 100% correct. But if I follow it up with the following textual support and say, my dog ate arsenic, right? And I unpack that. I'm like, yeah, we had rats in the house, and I sprinkled a whole bunch of arsenic beneath my kitchen sink. And this morning I went to get a cup of coffee, and Skipper's beneath the sink, and comes out and he's got white stuff all over his muzzle and his grizzle. Naturally, intuitively, logically, you all are going to say, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for Skipper. Your dog's going to die. That's logic, right? And all we're asking students to do here is think cogently on paper. Hence our hammering and carping that they sustain tight lines of reasoning. And this heuristic really helps structure that thinking and organize that thinking. So how do we morph Aristotle's heuristic into a heuristic for argumentation? It's going to look like this. First premise is an argument containing the verbiage of the prompt. You got to stay anchored in the parlance of the prompt. So we want to hear about like that ephemeral nature, the preservation, and the vanity in that first premise. And there's math to this. So that takes 3 sentences. And here's the reason why I want my students to take 3 sentences. We're arguing, and the argument needs to stay central. So if they're talking about textual support, especially in sentence 1 or sentence 2, if they're already into their example, it's not an argument, it's summation, right? So it's really key that we set our kids up to argue from top to bottom, because that's the demand of the assignment. So 4th sentence, my students transition into the second premise, and again, specific textual support. And then you got to make sure that body paragraphs are concluded. And by this, I just mean at the end of the body paragraph, you got to link it back to the thesis and the prompt in the first premise. One last piece of math. All of this is going to take about 10 to 12 sentences. I think that's a substantive body paragraph. Those little 4 or 5 line baggers, there's just not enough support or analysis in there. And this goes back to some questions that teacher might have in the virtual world of, Kristian, what do you say in 4 paragraphs, right? The 5-paragraph essay, I find students have really small, underdeveloped paragraphs, and you can do this in 4 paragraphs if you're specific, right? So 10 to 12 sentences, intro, body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, slap a conclusion on it. So let's break this down and look at some concrete examples. So you might be asking, Kristian, what does this first premise look like? I got an example for you. So again, it's going to take 3 sentences, and ultimately you got to segue into your specific support. So here it is. There is one caveat that invalidates Wortham's claim. The digital realm is wholly impermanent and tenuous at best. Even tech gurus like Zuckerberg and Elon Musk acknowledge the fact that the cloud can be snuffed out with a single solar flare or glitch in the power grid, which by default erases all culture that has been documented within the span of the current digital era. Unlike previous historical periods, like the Mayan civilization, present-day history is closely akin to a mayfly, the animal with the shortest lifespan, because of the temporal ability to preserve our collective history for future epochs. So you can see there, it takes 3 sentences, right, to argue, to keep the centrality of the argument. One of the things I ask my students is this at the end of their first premise. What's the promise of the first premise, right? So one of the things we got to, talk about, obviously, is Zuckerberg and Musk. We got to talk about the ephemeral nature. And then this teacher also alluded to the Mayan civilization. And we're going to have like this juxtaposition between the current era and the Mayans, right? That's the promise of the first premise. So the textual support must include those elements. So let's look at the transition into the second premise. So my students will just pivot, right? And again, this is all in the same paragraph. So these are not like separate paragraphs. You're doing this within the structure of one body paragraph. So look at the pivot point here. Take as a perfect case in point the principal reason why teenagers even take selfies in the first place, Snapchat. All right. So we're going to take a look, as we've been doing, at a teacher sample syllogistic body paragraph. So we're going to pick up at the 5th sentence. Note the specificity here, all right? This is something I really emphasize with my students. You can't be vague. The thing about this form is that snaps, unless otherwise directed, are erased from the system at the 24-hour mark. And at best, the selfie image can be preserved for only up to 30 days. By contrast, the Mayan Empire, centered in the tropical lowlands of what is now Guatemala, reached the peak of its power and influence around the 6th century AD. The Maya excelled at agriculture, pottery, writing, calendars, and mathematics, and left behind an astonishing amount of impressive architecture and symbolic artwork. How do we know this millennium after the fact, right? Again, you got to cook that specificity, right? You got to know the details. You got to know what you're talking about. So I'm going on to the next slide here. We're still in the second premise. That is the difference between permanent means of recording history versus the temporal nature of modern day preservation measures. Lastly, as Elon Musk knowingly attests and Mark Zuckerberg reluctantly acknowledges, the cloud, which stores all of our present day history, will inevitably be wiped out one day. Within these social media networks, the intent was never to be a library to house history indefinitely. All right. Go back to the promise of the first premise. You can see here there's support and analysis for everything that was dropped in that first premise. So this, like our line of reason is like really tight, really cogent. Look at the conclusion here. So usually this takes like 2 or 3 sentences. We got to swing it back to the thesis, like really hammer the thesis, hammer the prompt. As such, Wortham is half right and half wrong. Yes, selfies are in a sense a quasi-visual diary, a medium to capture our fleeting existence. But in terms of long-term documentation, that aspect is very much lacking. Today's society, unfortunately, is primarily concerned with participating in an ego frenzy, right? Because we gotta get, also argue that aspect of the prompt because there's a duality to the prompt, not the importance of indelibly capturing our brief existence. So that's the whole thing, right? This teacher went a little over 12 sentences, and I'm cool with that. You don't want to bloviate and go on into 28 sentences or whatever. But breaking the rules just a tad bit, if you got a purpose, if you got a reason, uh, is just fine. The main thing is to, keep the line of reasoning. So we've looked at intro. We've looked at one syllogistic body paragraph. Question becomes, what do I do next? And my friends, this is where things get really easy. Students just bust out another syllogism. They're going to adhere to that syllogistic method heuristic. We know it's 4 paragraphs, so you're just going to do the same thing. 3-sentence first premise, 4th sentence transition into the second premise, crank the specificity, wrap it back to the thesis in the prompt in the end, 10 to 12 sentences, right? So I'll give you a quick glance at that transition and how it works. I won't show you the whole thing. I think teachers and students can kind of figure it out with how far I take you in this. So again, I highlighted everything here. First premise, second premise. We're going to take 3 sentences to set up the argument. The digital era, although relatively brief in consideration to Earth's 4.5 billion year existence, has proven to be a fantastic means to preserve time and document the history of current generations. And while digital trends tend to evolve and come and go, as well as be a form of exhibitionism, history is nonetheless forever preserved. Even going as far back as the 1980s with things like film producing cameras, VCRs, compact discs, cassette tapes, floppy disks, Betamax, etc. All things that are not obsolete and antiquated. History is preserved. Even the vanity of the era is forever documented. Cool. So again, you tip your hand in the first premise. If we break this down into a promise, we have specific areas that we need to go into specifically in the second premise. So look at that again, the pivot point here. Take as a perfect case in point my parents' childhood and significant life events like their junior prom, wedding, and births of their children. Born in the mid 1970s, the devices used to capture these moments no longer are in use, but, and then boom, crank the specificity. And that's where you go. It's the exact same heuristic, exact same strategy as body paragraph number 1. So we still need to wrap up the essay. We got to tag a conclusion on this. And early in the academic year, just to demonstrate this and kind of have a scaffold or a structure for it, I give my students conclusion stems. My better writers tend not to use these. They're not like the most organic thing to conclude. But, my in the middle and then, the struggling, emerging students tend to use them come exam day. And ultimately, I liken the conclusion paragraph to the grand finale of a fireworks display, right? Big idea, big encapsulation, all encompassing remarks. So they segue into that conclusion with the following stems, like things of this nature, simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done at the end of the day. And then in terms of like length, we're looking for 3 to 4 sentences. So this is a teacher example, and you can see what's happening here. In no other words, the selfie serves no other purpose than to fleetingly capture one's vanity for a brief moment in time. Never intended to be a permanent fixture in the annals of history, this social trend is something future generations will find cringeworthy and invariably scoff at. On many levels, the trend solidifies the fact that the current generation is very much self obsessed and grossly in need of endless validation and social approval. Again, big fireworks at the end. Just hammer it, right? So I'm at the end. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me for any reason, feel free to drop me an email. My address is teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also note that I have a website, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. You can go there if you want to learn more about the professional development opportunities that I'm going to talk about here. So, as a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, one of the main points of feedback I received in doing like group professional developments was, man, oh man, Kristian, I wish I could have taken that course one-on-one because my needs are so specific. My district is very unique, or my students are very unique. So over the next few months, I'm going to work one-on-one in a mentorship model with teachers where we'll look at my heuristics, my word study academy, my nuance academy, look across the expository modes, even talk about my alternative grading methods. And what I've been doing in the past few months is either work one-on-one with teachers, or I've been coming into departments and kind of vertically aligning departments and making sure that teachers all have the same parlance when we're discussing writing. So more than happy to do that. Teachers often say, again, in the feedback at the National Writing Project, Kristian, I'm a teacher, I got no time for PD. So I made a super cool self-paced course. It's loaded with content. It's very, very exhaustive, very concrete. And again, you can go to the website and take a look at that, or drop me an email and say, hey, Kristian, I want to talk further about that. Same with the Teach It Right 5-week one-to-one mentorship. Drop me an email. Happy to hop on a call or a Zoom with you. And then one of the things I'm well known for are my alternative grading methods. I ditched the traditional grading paradigm years and years ago, which allowed me to reclaim my evenings and weekends. But I think above and beyond that, I'm a better practitioner for not doing the traditional grading paradigm. I don't think it's the best thing that we can do pedagogically to offer feedback. I don't think it helps students grow and flourish and mature as writers, as well as other methodologies. So with this, we could meet for 2 hours. You'll be totally independent at that point in time to incorporate these alternative grading methods. So, if you want to reclaim your evenings and weekends and really help your students augment their writing capabilities, it's a perfect course for you. So that's it. That's the end. I'll record the other 2024 AP Lang exams. We did set 1 and set 2. I just got to find time to record them. And it's all teacher exemplars. So very cool. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you in the next writing workshop video.